I don't particularly feel like doing a full-on high production values or whatever video right now. It's inappropriate characters tonight, and I've got some prep work to do for that, and it means another late night. And, you know, it's the weekend. And I have to force myself to take a break sometimes. But the consent thing is still weighing heavily on my mind, because it brings together a whole confluence of different things and problems that I'm not keen on, and a whole bunch of observations and the topics of recent videos and so on that I've made, or blog posts that I've wrote, and so on. Now, there are a lot of dickish people who are against this document and against similar things like lines and veils and so on. I think even for the dickish people, right, it's because they want to be left alone to do their thing, which is a laudable, reasonable goal, I think, in life, to just want to be left alone to get on with the things that you enjoy without other people interfering with it. Maybe they don't articulate that in the best way. Maybe some of them are genuinely abusive, but still, when you take issue with something like this consent document that Monte Cook Games put out, or when you take issue with an anti-harassment policy that a convention has brought in, or it doesn't mean you're against the idea of consent, and it doesn't mean that you're for harassment, perhaps in very rare edge cases, but it usually means that there is something else going on. Now, for me, that something else is that my primary concern is the art of gaming, the craft of it, and the maturity of it as a medium. You know, cinema hadn't been around that long when we had films that are still appreciated as classics. You know, there are some people that still have a certain appreciation of the silent era, but even all these years later, you look back on Metropolis or something, and it still holds up in a lot of ways. And RPGs have been around long enough now, I think, that we can say that it's a mature medium, and we should be able to handle mature topics. And yet it seems the more as time wears on, the less mature the medium seems to be getting. The part of it is the whole polarization and weirdness that we have in our societies in the West right now. There is no mood to compromise. There's no mood to even try to understand where the other side is coming from. And that's something I strive to do, but I never feel like that's reciprocated anymore. I mean, I can go into a conversation and I can spell out my objections are not X, Y, and Z, right? They're A, B, C, and then someone will immediately accuse me of X, Y, and Z. You can even explicitly state it. There is no willingness to assume good intent or good faith on the part of the other side. That's not good, right? And we'll get into more on that in a bit. But I think a lot of what it comes down to is differing goals. Role-playing games aren't a huge industry, in spite of the increased media presence and so on. It's just not a very profitable thing to be engaged in. But for the leading companies, particularly as kind of Eurogames and board games have gotten bigger, there has been this drive for a kind of corporate disinnification, family-friendly sort of thing. And that's coming from the bigger companies like Wizards and so on. And then from the indie scene, you have this drive to sanitize and make safe everything. It's the rhetoric is one of inclusion, the practice not so much, because they're seeking to override and exclude people. For people who toss the term gatekeepers around a lot, there is an awful lot of gatekeeping coming from that quarter, unfortunately. And they seem incapable of leaving people alone. But both of these forces combine to homogenize and dumb down and take the edge off the potential of a lot of role-playing games, stories, experiences that you can have at the table. That's not my goal. My goal is to create art, at least in some degree, low art in some degree. My aim is to move people, shake people, make them think. If I'm running a horror game, I want to horrify or disgust people. That's the point of horror. If it's science fiction or fantasy, I want to maybe engender a sense of wonder, or maybe I want to create the kind of brutal, prejudiced, horrible atmosphere of medieval England. There can be all kinds of goals, and they're all artistic goals, and they're all fun in their own way. So my approach, my desire for games is not one that seeks to impinge on others. I just want the freedom to do what I do unmolested. Careful choice of words there. So I think we have very different goals. Some people want a happy fun time. Some people want Tales of Equestria. Sometimes I want happy tree friends. Okay? We want different things. But I am willing to allow the space and consideration for other people to do their thing. But just like with the arguments, there is no reciprocal give for letting me do my thing unmolested. And we're seeing this increasingly manifest, whether from the monetary corporate side, or whether from the I don't even know what you call it, intersectional, maybe, the tolerance and inclusivity mafia. Whether, from one side or another, the end result is the same. What was it Twain said? Don't tell a man he can't eat steak because a baby can't chew it. But I agree. It doesn't mean I should go around force-feeding babies steak, but it also means that people shouldn't stop me eating steak just because babies can't eat it. And yet there's got to be room for a plurality of approaches to all this. So I look back over my old videos, because, well, not even that old, because it was back in June when I was talking with Kevin Rolfe, did the interview with him that I read out because he didn't want to be on camera, talked about the incident there. And that, to me, is a kind of, it's not the first incident like this, but it's one of the higher profile ones, at least here in the UK. I see that as the kind of canary in the coal mine of the problem with these kind of approaches. So you've got UK Games Expo, which is a big games convention in the UK. Role-playing games have been increasingly marginalised and tucked over to one side anyway, and now they're adopting this kind of family-friendly approach, which is exclusionary to a lot of more mature or violent or sexually tinged content, even in board games and so on, and also seems to be being open to abuse to persecute people who run games. Now, the absolute worst possible interpretation of what happened at this game was that the games master had something horrible, sexual, happen to their characters, but it was not described, it was not played out, it was something that happened off screen. The agency was taken away from their characters briefly, but whatever happened was not played out, and it was left up to their interpretation. They interpreted it in the worst way. The convention investigated, but frankly I don't trust the investigator, especially when it's this kind of quick knee-jerk reaction to Twitter storms and things, and they told him to sling his hook. But even in the worst interpretation of what happened, nothing there really violated anything. And furthermore, Rolf, the games master in question, did everything right that I could see. The scenario, as described, was what was played. The sign-up sheet noted that it was mature, that it was horror, but it was also immature because he referenced the In-Betweeners, if you know the show, which is kind of laddish, sex comedy, kind of crude, almost American Pie style humour, I guess. So anyone who knew any of that should have known what was going on, but that wasn't enough. That wasn't enough of a warning, apparently. And so I don't think the players are the victim here. I think the games master is the victim, being persecuted over someone's subjective interpretation of something that happened off screen. But that's not what anyone thinks of it. You know, the lie version of what supposedly happened, which is that they were underage players playing underage characters who were brutally raped in a completely described scene. That's the story. It's not true. It's not remotely true. Even checking all the facts that are available, nothing like that happened. But having these rules in place and so on enabled people to kick up a stink and get a long-time volunteer to that convention kicked out on someone's subjective say-so of what they think happened to them. Not even to them, to their characters, in fiction. Some people say, oh, the removal of agency from the characters is bad. Well, in a horror game, whether through madness or terror or kidnapping or torture or whatever else, it's almost impossible to have horror without the loss of agency. It's part of what makes horror horrific, being helpless in the face of something. Lovecraft's existential horrors that are beyond the ken of mortal man and cannot really be opposed, that's kind of like the big example of helplessness. And that's the horror that he was really trying to invoke. And yet we rage against it. I also recently talked about the ancient TSR D&D module, Palace of the Silver Princess, which was a big controversy at the time, kind of in the same way that the boobs and demons and devils was it the Fiend Folio or the Monster Manual? I always get confused over which one it is. One of them anyway. But yeah, and so they withdrew a whole bunch of copies of that and re-edited it and sent it out under a different cover. And Demons and Devils didn't reappear for a while. There were no more nipples in any D&D products. And all of this was similarly because of this whole family-friendly fiasco and idea that came in at TSR at the time as a way to kind of deal with the satanic panic issues that were arising. Well, let's get rid of the demons and the devils. Let's aim at a more childish market. Even though the majority of players at the time were college, university kids. It didn't make a particular lot of sense. I guess commercially in the long run it worked out, but artistically and creatively it was stifling to a nascent industry in a lot of ways. When it came to White Wolf in the 90s, now the 90s, for those of you who weren't around for them, God, I'm getting old, that was another peak of this whole political correctness thing. And that's why so many of the old White Wolf books have female pronouns throughout the whole thing. Terrible English, bad grammar. My teachers would have a field day with them for doing it. I'm not going to belabor the point about the English language and how there's a female pronoun but there isn't a male pronoun right now. But yeah, kind of jarring. But they were trying to make something that, in the blurb and in the style and in the approach to gaming at least, was more mature, more adult, handled more adult subjects, and for all that a lot of people played the games as, undead superheroes or whatever else, an attempt was made to understand that you were playing monsters. And I grasped that in both hands. I played characters that explored concepts of non-human morality and things like that, and genuine horror. I ended up joining the LARP Society. Again, we'll kind of come back to that in a bit. A lot of positives in terms of story and so on, a lot of negatives from the kinds of people that ended up in charge and running it and making rules for others, which is what we're going to come back to. The rule we had there was a sort of fade to black, which meant that if something was happening that you were deeply uncomfortable with as a player, it would just fade to black. Right? It didn't mean the thing didn't happen. You couldn't call a halt to it. You couldn't order that it be changed. But if you were being made really uncomfortable or someone was creeping you out or whatever, you just fade to black. Whatever happened, it just wasn't described. And that was... I wasn't particularly fond of that, but it was a compromise I could live with. Now, White Wolf, for being a hyper PC company, you know, their successors today have been running afoul of the same kind of woke squad and the cancel culture and the shaming and so on. The original Bruges Clan book, I think, had a skinhead character in it, and I don't recall a huge fuss about that. It also had a prostitute character. I don't recall a huge fuss about that. In fact, one of the girls at our regular LARP session decided to base her character on that, which we were all very grateful for when the PVC corsets and so on came out. But now, today, in today's atmosphere, they put an alt-right NPC in, and that's the end of the world. You know, they've always tackled politics and real-world issues in the background of White Wolf products, of vampire, a mage, werewolf, and so on. It's always been an integral part of it. So why suddenly that was not okay in a company or a successor company with decades of reputation of being PC and of learning from their mistakes and handling things more sensitively, suddenly to get turned on was very weird and kind of displacing. But I think that also helps show how big the problem is becoming. That companies feel hemmed in their creativity, that they feel that they can't tackle difficult subjects, or they have to go back, or they have to reverse, or they have to change, or they have to re-edit. Things like the Chechen camps for gays, which is a real thing, you know, that they put into the game because it's always related to politics. They had to go back and change that. Something is wrong when a creative company with a pedigree of being PC includes edgy content and it's just assumed it must be out of malice, or that somehow in the intervening 20 years we've lost the capability to deal with difficult subjects in an adult and mature manner. Sure, some people won't, other people will. So what? I have mental health issues, terrible social anxiety, sometimes crippling depression, suicidal depression. So another aspect of the excuse making that goes on around this stuff really bothers me, even triggers me, you might say. And that is the idea that by rendering all of our game spaces, our game tables, our clubs, our conventions into anodyne, safe, mushy pablum, that this is somehow doing some great, wonderful thing for people like me who have mental health issues. Gaming is a space to escape from this kind of bullshit, or to claim agency or power over it, over the real world, over politics, over things that upset and scare you and so on. And it is a completely safe environment. You cannot be hurt at the table unless we completely redefine the meaning of hurt to mean either mild discomfort, mild emotional discomfort. No, I go by the harm principle, and that means actual, real physical harm. But a harm, perhaps, is being done, ironically, by these attempts to make spaces safe, not that they were ever unsafe to begin with. there's numerous papers now, I keep up on the literature because of my own problems, that say that at the very least things like trigger warnings and safe spaces and so on don't help, and there's a fairly strong indicator that they may actually be harmful. By preventing people from facing their demons in a safe and supportive environment, like a gaming table with friends, you may be harming them, because you may be deepening their aversions, increasing the power of their triggers, creating an expectation in them that they never ever have to face the things that upset them. It's not helpful. It's probably harm. Not to the level that anti-vaccination is harm, but if you think about it, it's not too dissimilar. When you're vaccinated, you are given a harmless version, a dead version of a disease that can't hurt you. But your body learns to protect itself from that harmless version of the disease. And if you encounter something that upsets you in a game, well, you're not yourself, you're your character, right? But you can deal with it. Maybe you can draw something from that next time you encounter your problem in real life. You know, if you sat there and you grit your teeth and you got through a description of Shelob, then maybe the next time you have to move a house spider out of your sitting room, you won't freak out quite so much. Just a thought, and this seems to be what the literature is showing. The other big divide is between voluntarism and authoritarianism. Another excuse that people are making for all this stuff is that, although the company is deciding to self-censor, or these tools are optional, nobody has to use them. But when a company is essentially forced by an online fuss, though I think more of them should ignore it, then it's no longer their decision. It's a mistaken public relations decision, in my not so humble opinion. And when tools like this are endorsed by a big name in gaming like Monte Cook, then they start to have some traction and gravity, and it becomes an expectation. You know, when they get written into rules for games, that's a bit of a problem, I think, because that's then creating the expectation that you can just use these tools, that every table uses these tools, when you're quite likely to just piss a lot of people off and make yourself unwelcome, which is the opposite to what the goal of these tools are. But as we covered with the Rolf incident at UK Games Expo, increasingly these rules aren't optional. They are being enforced by busybodies who work their way into positions of power in organisations because nobody else wants the job. None of the people that want the jobs end up in the jobs, and so you get busybodies who feel like they have to justify their existence, or again make bad PR decisions because they're under pressure to do so. And that means it's not voluntary, right? And when this is, you know, the big convention in the UK that's impactful upon people's business and their ability to get their game out there, and also impactful on a lot of people's ability to play in or run the games that they want, so it's no longer voluntary, it's authoritarian. And if you look at the tools, I think I said before, Pundit's comparison with Maoism is obviously hyperbole and kind of stupid, but it's also not. There's a section in that where you're supposed to kind of decompress and talk it out with someone who invoked the rules. They never have to give you an explanation or whatever. But this session is not to find some compromise or mutual understanding. It's for you to learn from the person that you upset. And that's it. It's markedly similar to a struggle session, to some of the haranguing and so on that we've seen in universities over the last, nearly 10 years? Must be getting on for. That's not conducive to art, that's not conducive to creating a welcoming atmosphere. It's intolerant and it's not seeking compromise or mutual understanding. It's just telling one side that they are absolutely, unquestionably wrong, and demanding that they change the way they do things, rather than taking personal responsibility. That's probably another split, is, and this is the one that surprises me the most, because a lot of the people talking about these rules and things, they style themselves as left-wing, but they're taking a very sort of right-wing individualistic approach to this. A gaming group is tell where my mind is. A gaming group is not just one person, right? It's all of them. The games master puts a lot more effort in. They probably deserve a bit more respect. They're given the kind of role, at least, of referee and narrator. But it's a whole group of people. And you've got to weigh their pleasure, their enjoyment, their immersion against momentary mild discomfort for you. And for people who claim to be left-wing, they're placing the individual in weirdly high priority over everybody else. And when we're talking about conventions and so on, applying these rules in an authoritarian and demanding manner, backed up by terms and conditions that often aren't actually legal, it's an even bigger problem, and it's even more impactful. And it's not strictly voluntary, and that's a big problem. There's an irony in that all this is being done in the name of tolerance and acceptance, and yet it's rooted in utter intolerance and a refusal to accept other people's point of view. The fact that other people want to play differently, that some people want to use the trapeze without a safety net because it's more exhilarating. And there's just no effort to understand that or to accept that or to make room for it. Everyone has to bend to these rules, to these tools, whatever you want to call them. And there's no room for compromise on the other side, even though they're calling themselves agents of tolerance and acceptance. They're not. They also often accuse people of gatekeeping when they're the ones doing the majority of the gatekeeping. Yet there has to be a compromise. There has to be a way between the two poles. A lot of it is just performative wokeness, right? These tools have absolutely no place in your home games. You're never going to need them. Not an issue. Games clubs and so on, if a table wants to use those, then fine. But if it's adopted as a rule of the club, which it probably is going to be in terms of university clubs and so on, then that's an imposition. And it stifles people's creativity if they want to be part of that organisation, or if they want to attend a convention or whatever else. If they're kept optional, not so much of a problem. But then we do run into problems like the Kevin Rolfe situation, where he's done everything right. He's included disclaimers, age, reference, content warning, all the rest, and still gets excoriated for it. But what he did should be enough. The compromise to me would be, okay, we'll age rate our games, and say vaguely what they're about, not completely accurately, not breaking it all down, because that's spoilers, right? And that also robs the games of fun. But if I'm running something that says 18 horror sexual themes, right? That's the kind of breadth that I'm talking about. You should know enough to stay away, or to remove yourself from the game without being too disruptive if it's not for you. Of course, this is further complicated at conventions because they often charge money for you to play games now, and that's not a development that I think should exist. Or if you feel that you have to remove yourself from a game, you should get a refund, but the games master shouldn't get in trouble. There is a compromise there, and it's in that kind of labelling, that kind of non-specific content labelling, and people taking responsibility for their own mental health, their own issues, their own problems with content. If someone has a peanut allergy, they avoid peanuts. We don't force everybody to avoid peanuts. Can you at least see where I'm coming from a little bit? But it's just interesting to watch all of this going on, to see the same things wanted to be gotten rid of by a moralizing right and a moralizing left, and both of them so utterly convinced of their righteousness. How awful goodness is. Zang. Just quickly, I remembered I didn't cycle back to what I was going to say about the Camarilla. Now, one of the things that seems to have upset people is me saying that this is basically a narcissist's charter to fuck up any and every game that they end up involved in, and people are going to use it to cheat and so on. If you don't understand that, have you ever met a human being? And the reason that relates to the Camarilla was, I mean, like I was saying, the people who shouldn't have power tend to gravitate towards positions of power, and then they seek to justify their existence there by wielding power. What was ostensibly a live-action role-playing society, with a common goal of creating good games and stories, rapidly became worn down with rules, and the only people that ever wanted to be in a position of power, whether it was a coordinator or a storyteller or whatever else, rapidly it was completely taken over by cunts. And these people used and abused the rules and the arbitration systems and so on to avoid in-character outcomes for their characters, to play favourites. They would cheat, they would lie, they would fuck you over, and when you justifiably got angry because of that, they would then use the arbitration system to punish you while they got off scot-free. It was shit. And a lot of these rules and ideas that were brought in there, like, rare things should be rare, right? So you need to get clearance to use them in your game, rapidly became ways of applying favoritism or excluding certain people or just being a dick to certain people, because people are people, and they will find a way to abuse, sidestep, twist, distort, and otherwise ruin whatever rules you seek to put in place. And again, I point to what happened to Kevin Rolfe as an example of well-intentioned rules ending up causing more problems than they solve. So that's where I was coming from with that. Rezang.